Hello and welcome to the next installment of our Understanding Nature series. I'm Tim, coming to you from Fontenelle Forest. Today's a little bit different because we are recording this program in advance. We're not live today because I'm not going to be around next week, but I will be back in 2 weeks with another live program. So hopefully you'll tune in for that because it's going to be a good one. And today we're going to talk about wetlands. We're going to take a look at wetlands, some of the services that they provide, and some of the plants and animals that live in the wetlands. So when we talk about wetlands, what are we talking about? Well, a wetland is defined as a distinct ecosystem that's flooded by water, either permanently or seasonally. And they are considered to be one of the most biologically diverse of all ecosystems. Now, in some definitions, wetland includes riparian zones, and riparian zone is the interface between land and a river or a stream. So it's that area just adjacent to the stream banks or the river banks, spreading out from there. And for our purposes today, we're also going to include ponds, because wetlands can include small bodies of water, and a lot of our wetlands include small open areas like ponds. So the main types of wetlands are a marsh, which is a forested wetland, a swamp, which is a wetland dominated by herbaceous, and herbaceous is just not shrubs and trees. Herbaceous is just like grasses and things like that. So that a swamp is dominated by herbaceous vegetation. A bog is a wetland that accumulates peat, and peat is a deposit of dead plant material. And then a fen is kind of like a peat. A fen is kind of like a bog in that it accumulates peat, but instead of being more of a flooded area, it's fed by groundwater. So they have a higher nutrient level than a bog. And then a pond is just a small area of still fresh water. It's more open than these other wetlands. So here's some of to give you a visual, up here on the left, we have a swamp. Over here on the right is a marsh, and down here on the lower left is a bog, and on the lower right is a fen. Kind of hard to tell those two apart. And then, of course, we have a pond, our open area. Now, there's many ways that a wetland can form. Glacial potholes, depressions, where water might be semi-permanent, so it might be wet when it's rainy or after the snow melts, but then dries out later in the summer. The fringes of permanent bodies of water, so around the outside of a pond or a lake, or an area where the river floods, a floodplain. Natural springs or groundwater can create wetlands. And then, of course, beaver activity. We talked about beavers a few weeks ago. Beavers create a lot of wetlands. They create ponds and marshes and swamps. Or they can be man-made. A lot of times we create wetlands for the benefits that they provide. And wetlands are dynamic. So just because this is a swamp now doesn't mean it's going to stay a swamp. So a lake with a wetland fringe, it might fill in with sediment, and it might become a swamp. A pond might eventually morph into a bog or a fen as that plant matter accumulates and it kind of fills in. Sediment can fill up a river marsh. So you get flooding, the flooding deposits sediment in the marsh, and that marsh can fill in and it might become a wet meadow, or it might start sprouting trees and become a swamp. This happens frequently with beaver activity. When a beaver abandons a dam, that dam traps sediment, and that pond might become a wet meadow. So that happens quite frequently. Or the opposite can happen. We can have a flood, and the flood can scour out that land, and it can turn a marsh or a swamp or a bog into open water. So that opposite can happen too. So these systems are always changing. They're very dynamic. Now, wetlands provide a number of what I've called social services. So some of these social values, we might go swimming. We might go swimming in a pond. A lot of you might have grown up in a rural area where there were lots of ponds, or you lived on a farm, you had a pond, and maybe you went swimming in there, or fishing. So we can go fishing in these wetland areas. And actually a lot of centuries ago, or a century or so ago, I should say, a lot of small towns, small rural towns had ponds as kind of the, the center of their town, so that that would be a place you would go. You didn't have movies and TV and things like that, so you'd take your family and you'd go to the town pond and have a picnic and go swimming or fishing. So they were kind of social centers too. Now also we use them for livestock. So if many ranchers have ponds that they either have created or are natural on their land, and that serves as a great source of drinking water for their livestock, because otherwise they have to, figure out a way to get water out there. And of course, wildlife are going to use these wetlands as a drinking water source too. Now, ecologically speaking, wetlands provide a lot of ecological functions and ecological value. So by slowing streams down, streams that flow into this area, the water spreads out, it slows that stream flow, so that's going to reduce erosion. It's going to store water, so that water more slowly drains out into this stream. So that might keep that stream flowing throughout the year, or at least longer into the year, because that water is released slowly rather than just flowing straight through. This saturated peat is going to help store water. They're going to trap sediments and pollutants. So sediment flowing from this stream is going to settle out into this pond, and it's going to help, or in this wetland or marsh, and it's going to help keep the water flowing out a lot cleaner. Pollutants are going to get trapped in there. They're going to store carbon, and that's going to help with global warming, global climate change. They allow water to infiltrate into the groundwater, so replenishing those aquifers, that groundwater underneath here. That's an important function of these wetland systems. But maybe most importantly, they're going to provide critical habitat to a lot of our wildlife. So like I mentioned earlier, wetlands are considered to be one of the most biologically diverse ecosystems. So there's a great many plants and animals that live in and around wetlands. And today I'm just going to talk about a few of those, because otherwise we could go on for hours and hours talking about all the different animals that live in wetlands. So let's start out small. We're going to start out microscopically small. So some of the smallest life that would find its home in a wetland is going to be some of the most important and some of the most amazing. So up here in the upper left, we have algae, and algae are just small plants. Now, they're not really all that exciting, but they form the basis of the food web in the wetlands. So they're on the very bottom. There's lots of algae and lots of things that will eat algae. Now, over here on the right, this is a cool little creature. This is called a hydra, and this is a microscopic organism. It's a little bit like a jellyfish. So on one end, it's got a foot, and on this end, where its mouth is, on the right here, it's got these tentacles, and these tentacles have stinging cells on them, just like a jellyfish. So sometimes it floats, sometimes it'll attach to the bottom with this foot, and it'll float around and it'll look for small things that it can eat. It'll sting them, stun them, and then it pulls it into this mouth. Now, that's not the most amazing thing about the hydra, though. Hydras are really cool. So they can regenerate. Hydras do not die of old age. They do not age. So they can regenerate their cells endlessly. So that's really interesting to scientists. How do they do this? And this provides some maybe exciting possibilities for addressing the issues that come with age in us, in people. Now, the other interesting thing about the hydra is if you cut this hydra in half, the foot end will grow a new head, and the head end will grow a new foot. Now, that's a pretty good trick if you can pull it off. And if you cut this hydra into pieces, the pieces that don't have the head or foot on them will grow a new head and a new foot. So that's pretty cool. Now, this little guy down here on the left, you might have seen him before. That's called a tardigrade. And the tardigrade is really interesting. I'm going to talk more about him. So the tardigrade is also known as a water bear or a moss piglet. Now they are microscopic. They are the size of a period at the end of a sentence. So very small, but they are considered to be one of the toughest animals on the planet, if you can believe that. They are found everywhere on the planet. They've been found from the highest mountains down in the Antarctic, the very bottom of the ocean, mud volcanoes, so they can survive pretty much anywhere. Now, normally their lifespan's about 3 or 4 months. It's not that long. Doesn't seem that tough, right? Up to about 2 years. But in extreme conditions, the tardigrade can suspend its metabolism. So it can lower its metabolism to 0.01% of normal. And in that state, they can go without food or water for up to 30 years. And then they can rehydrate and just resume life as normal. Now, there are about 1,300 species of tardigrades, so they can't all do this, but a lot of them can. Now, some species can withstand the vacuum of space. They've been sent up into outer space, as well as pressure that's more than 1,200 times atmospheric pressure, actually up to about 6,000 atmospheres, which is 6 times more pressure than the very bottom of the Marianas Trench in the deepest part of the ocean. They can withstand 1,000 times more radiation than other animals. So that's pretty amazing. So this gives some weight to the idea that maybe life on Earth started from outer space, that something came and landed on Earth, landed in the water, and it kind of started that life on Earth. I'm just going to show you a short video here about the tardigrade.
Tardigrades, that are known as cute and cuddly water bears, can survive a lot of torture. The tiny organism's huggability factor is debatable, but the animal's toughness is not. Most recently, scientists in Japan thawed out 3 Antarctic tardigrades after more than 30 years of frozen slumber. And what did the water bears do? Well, one died, but the other 2 laid some eggs and kept on living. Just like in extreme heat, drought, pressure, and radiation tests before, the water bears slowly started to go about their usual business. And that's why these cute little guys are actually terrifying. They live all over the world, usually in damp moss or dirt, but there are also fresh and saltwater varieties. Tardigrades are also microscopic, somewhat transparent, and can walk around slowly on 8 legs. Water bears aren't supposed to live very long, usually about a year at most, but in that time, a tardigrade can lay 30 to 40 eggs. They also occasionally eat some of those eggs to improve their own health. Other water bear food sources include amoebas, nematodes, and other tardigrades. Yes, some of them are cannibals. Still think they're cute? Okay, let's go back to the part where they can prolong their lives. Scientists have radically altered tardigrades' environments in studies, and much like cockroaches, the organisms adapt to survive. The New York Times writes, confronted with drying, rapid temperature changes, changes in water salinity, or other problems, tardigrades can curtail their metabolism to 0.01% of normal. The result is a deep sleep, almost death-like state, similar to the 30-year freezing test. One time, the European Space Agency sent about 3,000 water bears into space, and guess what? A lot of them survived. No water, no air, and cosmic radiation, no problem. You see, scientists aren't just abusing them for fun. Tardigrades make good experimental candidates like fruit flies, but hardier. And maybe water bears could lead to leaps and bounds in cryonics, a type of cold preservation that could allow humans to fall into a frozen sleep and wake up many years later, none the worse. Whew. But discoveries like that are probably still a ways off, so it's fair to assume the internet's beloved water bears will continue to be tormented, all in the name of science. For Newsy, I'm Leah Becerra.
So pretty cool stuff. Now these aren't as exciting as water bears, but you've seen them all over, especially in wetlands. These are cattails. So about anywhere between 3 and 10 feet tall. They kind of live on the edge of clean ponds and ditches. So they're actually a really good indicator of clean water because they really like clean water. And they spread through rhizomes, which are underground, but also through seeds. So they have this seed head, and each of those seed heads contains about 250,000 seeds. Let me see if I can show you this. This is a seed head. So when it comes time to seed, all these seeds, they're almost like dandelion seeds. They're very fluffy, and so they will be dispersed by the wind and fly off until they find a good spot to land and to sprout. These are very important in our wetlands because they provide a lot of shelter for nesting birds. Red-winged blackbirds really like these cattails. Dragonflies really like them. Now the other cool thing about cattails is that they're edible. So these were an important food source for the early settlers and the Native Americans. So the lower leaves can be used in salads. The young stems can be eaten raw or boiled. Supposedly they taste like potatoes. They kind of look like green onions, but they're supposed to taste like potatoes. They're very starchy. Young flowers can be boiled or roasted like corn. That's down here on the left. The pollen can actually be added to pancakes to make the pancakes more nutritious. And it also is used as a thickener. It was used as a thickener in stews and soups. The root can be dried and pounded into a very nutritious flour. So these are very edible plants. Water lilies, these are white pond lilies. So these are a very common sight in wetlands and ponds. So they provide a lot of food for fish and wildlife, also shelter for fish. The fish like to swim amongst the stems and roots, keeps them safe from bigger fish. The leaves are subject to tearing, so they can be kind of tough, and they're kind of waxy, and they're waterproof on the top. And the leaves and flowers float. Now the flowers open each day and they close each night. And once the flower is pollinated, the plant will pull the fruit back underwater to mature. And then it'll burst actually underwater and spread the seeds. So, and again, this was an important food source. The seeds, the flowers, the leaves, and the rhizomes are all edible of water lilies. So the Native Americans used the rhizomes medicinally too. They used them to treat coughs and colds. And the stem was used to treat toothaches. You could grind it up into kind of a poultice and place it on the tooth, and it helped with toothaches. And the submerged stems in the muck are good food for muskrats. Muskrats really like them. So let's go back to some of our animals. We're getting a little bigger than our water bears. This is a predacious diving beetle. Predacious diving beetles are neat little beetles. So what they do is they will actually trap a bubble of air under their elytra. The elytra is this hard covering over their wings. They'll trap a bubble of air and they'll dive down, and they'll use that bubble like a scuba tank. So they're like a little scuba diver. Now they do have wings, so if they're in a small body of water and it starts to dry up in the summer, they can fly off and find a new body of water. And they're called predacious. The word predacious means they're predators. So they eat other insects, other aquatic invertebrates. So they live in the water, they lay their eggs in the water, and when those eggs hatch, they look kind of like this little guy here, which actually looks very similar to a dragonfly larva. But they will eat, you can see this one's got even the larvae are predacious. They'll eat other insect larvae, they'll eat tadpoles, they'll eat small fish, anything they can get a hold of. So let's talk about dragonflies. Dragonflies and damselflies. Some of the first winged insects to evolve were dragonflies and damselflies. They've been around for a really long time, about 300 million years. So the largest of our modern dragonflies have a wingspan of a couple of inches. You know, we've seen those, like this one here on the right. Pretty big guys. But there have been fossils found of fossilized dragonflies with wingspans up to 2 feet. So try to imagine a dragonfly with a wingspan of 2 feet. That's a big dragonfly. Now, dragonflies and damselflies are related, but they're not the same. And we all kind of default to calling these dragonflies. Here on the right and down here on the bottom left are damselflies, but they're really not the same. They're closely related. But let's look at the differences. So the dragonfly has a much thicker body than the damselfly. The damselfly has this very thin body. Look at the wings. The dragonfly holds its wings horizontal, and the damselfly holds the wings vertically. And with the dragonfly, the hind wings are thicker than the forewings. So with the damselfly, they're about the same. Now, they are similar in a lot of ways. They both live near water. They both lay their eggs near or in water. They're both predatory. They eat insects, and they can eat hundreds of insects per day. So one of their favorite foods is mosquitoes. So they're great for mosquito control. And they don't bother us. They don't bother people. They don't bite or anything like that. Now their head, actually I'm going to jump back to that other slide. Their head is almost all eye. You can see here like on the bottom right. They have very good vision. About 80% of their brain is dedicated to eyesight because their eyes are so big. And they're expert flyers. They can fly forward, backward, they can fly up, down, and they can hover. They even eat and mate while flying. The max speed of our larger dragonflies, they can get up to about 35 miles an hour when they're trying, but 9 miles an hour is their average cruising speed. So here's the life cycle. They mate, they lay their eggs in the water, and the larvae emerge from the eggs. And down here on the right, this is a picture of a dragonfly larva, and they live in the water eating aquatic invertebrates, kind of like our diving beetle. And dragonflies live about 5 years, but by far, most of that 5 years is spent in this stage as the larva, not as the dragonfly that we typically see flying around. The flying stage actually only lasts anywhere between a few weeks up to about 9 months in some species. So when they're ready for their final molt, they climb out of the water and they emerge from this shell. Cicadas, it's very similar to cicadas, if you know what those are. And then they dry out their wings and they start flying around and get ready to repeat this cycle. So this is a video of a dragonfly flying in slow motion. This is really cool. Now dragonflies can't walk. There's a fun fact for you. Dragonflies can't walk. Their legs are only used for perching, for pushing off to take flight, and for capturing prey. And their wings beat synchronously, so at the same time when they take off, and that gives them maximum lift, but asynchronously, so their wings don't beat at the same time when they're flying forward or when they're hovering. And when they're flying forward, that actually helps them save energy because the back wings kind of get that draft from the front wings. Let's take a look. pretty neat. Bullfrogs. If you've ever been to any kind of wetlands, you're likely you heard or saw bullfrogs. A big female bullfrog can weigh almost 2 pounds, about 1.8 pounds. Their lifespan's about 8 to 10 years. And I'm going to tell you how to tell the difference between a male bullfrog and a female bullfrog. This structure right here, behind the eye, that looks kind of like a circle or a donut, that's called the tympanum. And what that is that's the frog's ear. That's basically the eardrum that's right on the side of its head. So in the male bullfrog, the tympanum is as large or larger than its eye. And in the female bullfrog, it's smaller than the eye. So apparently male bullfrogs, very good listeners. Now the male bullfrog also has this yellow throat. And when he's singing for the ladies, he inflates that big yellow throat. And that helps attract the female bullfrog. Here's what they sound like. So they lay their eggs in the water, and a single female bullfrog will lay about 20,000 eggs at a time. And they do this about once a year. So why so many? Any animal that produces this many young, because you know we don't end up with 20,000 young bullfrogs, any animal that has a survival strategy where they produce many offspring, it's because many of their offspring don't survive. So they produce 20,000 eggs and only a few will survive. So they go through a metamorphosis. This is a bullfrog tadpole here. And this one doesn't have any legs. This one you can see it's kind of started. And actually this is one that my daughters and I caught in our wetlands here at Fontenelle Forest. And you can see it's starting to go through metamorphosis. It's starting to get its hind legs there. Now they can, depending on where they're at, bullfrogs can take either a few months to transform from a tadpole into an adult frog, up to a couple of years. They can actually, farther north where the water stays colder, it will take up to 2 years for them to completely transform, and they will actually overwinter under the ice. Farther south where the water stays warmer during the year, then that process is much quicker. Now, something I didn't know until somebody mentioned it to me, and I looked it up, is that bullfrogs are actually not native to Nebraska. They were native to the southeast United States, but they were introduced here, and they're actually the only frog in Nebraska that's considered to be invasive. They're considered to be an invasive species. And they were actually brought in the 1800s by French fur traders as food stock. So anyone who's ever been to the South knows that frog legs are a thing, and yes, they do actually taste like chicken. They're actually not bad, but they were brought here as food stock by French fur traders. Of course, they escaped into the wild, and they're prolific breeders, so they do quite well. And now they've actually expanded their range all the way out into the western United States too. So try frog legs. They're good. Now this big fella is the common snapping turtle. So the average weight of a snapping turtle, they can get up to about 35 pounds. And they can live over 100 years. They're actually very long-lived. The shell, you know, in the cartoons, you often see a turtle taking off its shell and hanging it up. And now real turtles can't actually do that. The shell of the snapping turtle is actually part of its spine and rib cage. So which is really interesting. Evolution has made this pretty cool. And I'm gonna hold one up here, see if I can get it so the camera can see it. And you can see the spine here on the inside of the shell. And this is a snapping turtle shell. And what this is the ribs have flattened out and fused together. And that's what forms the turtle shell. And this is true for all of our turtles. Now the back of the shell is covered in scales, and these scales are made of keratin. And you might know something else that's made of keratin, because it's your fingernails. Fingernails are made of keratin. Now snapping turtles are not generally aggressive towards people. Now out of the water, they're much more aggressive, because on land, they're very kind of slow, they're very awkward. So a lot of times you'll see these guys crossing the road. If you want to help them, get them off the road, be very careful doing it. Keep your distance, because they can be aggressive, particularly on land. If they're in water, they're more likely to see you as a predator and just swim away. People sometimes worry about snapping turtles grabbing their toes. As far as I can tell, as far as my research has shown, this very rarely, if ever, happens. Snapping turtles are much more likely to swim away and hide than to attack your toes if you're swimming in a pond. But they will be aggressive on land. And if you try to grab them from the back, and you should never grab them by the shell, because that can actually damage their spine. If you try to grab them, even from their back feet, they can reach their neck all the way around. So they have very long necks. That neck extends out quite far. So normally, they will dig into the mud at the bottom of a pond or a wetland or a marsh, and they will sit down there. Now in shallow water, they'll just stay down there and they'll extend their head out to get a breath, and then they'll pull it back in. And they hunt by sitting very still. And they'll sit very still, sometimes with their mouth open, and they'll wait for something to come by, and then they'll snap at it, which is how they got their name. So they will eat plants, but they'll also eat fish, frogs, reptiles. So a lot of our bullfrog tadpoles probably end up being food for snapping turtles. And even birds and small mammals. So they've been known to eat ducklings, they've been known to eat baby muskrats, things like that. So their main threats are habitat loss, primarily, and habitat fragmentation, because they will move between wetlands, especially if one starts to dry out. And a full-grown adult snapping turtle has very few predators. The primary cause of death for adult snapping turtles is car strikes. They get hit by cars crossing the road when traveling between wetlands. I had a lady tell me in a program once, we were talking about snapping turtles, and she told me she used to own an Austin Healey Sprite. And if you know what an Austin Healey Sprite is, it's a very small sports car, very low to the ground. And she told me she hit a snapping turtle once and it completely destroyed her car. So you don't want to hit one. They will damage your car. Now they're quite widespread. I can get my mouse back. So pretty much anywhere east of the Rocky Mountains, where you find a permanent body of water, that's decent snapping turtle habitat. So you can kind of see where this line stops is you're starting to get into the foothills of the Rockies out here. And that's where your wetlands and your wet ponds and things like that are going to start to become a little less frequent, and that big old snapping turtle is not going to go climbing any mountains. Now they do lay their eggs on land. So mama turtle will dig a hole and she'll lay between 25 and 40 eggs. So again, we've got an animal who is laying a lot of eggs, a lot of potential offspring, because a lot of those won't survive. The babies hatch in late summer, and once mama lays the eggs, she's done. That's the extent of her parental duties. These turtles are on their own once she covers them up. So other animals will raid those nests. Minks, skunks, foxes, and particularly raccoons really like to eat snapping turtle eggs. And this is a video. This was taken by one of our part-time naturalists here at the forest, Liz, and it shows you a turtle nest that's been dug up.
Am I on? Okay. Okay, gang, we've been walking here along South Stream Trail, and I wanted to show you something kind of cool that I found here. If you look down here, what I found on the ground is actually a turtle's nest. This is a nest that a stamping turtle would have made. If you see here, she would have dug in about 6 to 7 inches deep to lay her eggs. And what we have are actual eggs of a snapping turtle, but they don't look right. Normally these eggs would be about the size of a ping pong ball. They're pretty leathery, but what's happened here, you can see all the egg casings are scattered out, is we've had a predator that has come in and helped themselves to lunch on these eggs. Now that predator, I can't really tell, there's no footprints to tell us for sure, but it might have been a raccoon, could have been a mink, maybe a fox, but they had breakfast on the eggs, so we're not going to get any snapping turtles out of here. One of the interesting things that we find about snapping turtles is the sex of the turtle is dependent on the temperature of the ground of the nest where they're laid, where the eggs are laid. If the temperature is cooler, then we have males that hatch out of the eggs. If the temperature of the nest is warmer, then the sex of the babies in the eggs are going to be females. So I just thought this was pretty cool and that you might enjoy seeing this.
So let's talk about herons. So herons are wading birds. So over here on the left, we have a great blue heron. They stand between 4 and 5 feet tall, and they have a wingspan of between 5.5 and 6.5 feet. And great blue herons are diurnal. That means they're out during the day. Over here on the right, we have a green heron. Green herons are only about 17 inches tall, and they tend to be more what we call crepuscular, or not. Crepuscular means that they're active at dusk and dawn, or nocturnal. So nocturnal, of course, means they're out at night. Green herons are either out dusk and dawn or at night, and our blue herons out more during the day. Now, both types of herons eat primarily small fish, but they'll also feed on pretty much anything they can get a hold of. Shrimp, crab, crayfish, any kind of aquatic insects or invertebrates, small rodents if they can get them, amphibians, and even ducklings. And usually what they'll do is they'll swallow them whole. Now the green heron is really interesting because the green heron is one of the few birds that will use tools. So they will actually use a piece of bread if they can find it, or a small insect, and they'll use it as bait. They'll drop it in the water, and when a fish comes up to get that, then they eat the fish. Now when they catch frogs, green herons will actually drown the frogs before they eat them, before they swallow them. Now blue herons especially will create what are called rookeries or heronries. Heronry is more specific. A lot of birds create rookeries. So heronries is specific to herons. And what that means is that they will nest together. So they'll come back in the spring, and there can be anywhere between 5 and 500 nests in this heronry. The average is about 160. And they're usually within 2.5 to 3 miles of a good feeding site. Green herons sometimes create heronries, but not always. So it's just one of those things. Sometimes they nest alone, sometimes they gather together. Now the last critter I'm going to talk about is our muskrat. So muskrat is smaller. Sometimes people mistake these for beavers, but muskrats are much smaller than beavers. So muskrats not only have this long, thin tail versus the beaver's big, wide, fat tail. A muskrat only weighs between 2 and 4 pounds. They're very small, whereas a beaver, you're talking about 30 or 40 pounds. They don't have webbed feet, but they are semi-aquatic. They live in the water. And their lodge is somewhat similar to a beaver lodge, but it's made more out of plants. So a beaver lodge is more of that woody sticks and branches. A muskrat lodge is more of these reeds, cattail, things like that. Usually they build it on a solid base, and they use very little mud. So a beaver lodge is kind of built out in the water, and they use a lot of mud to pack it together. Now, muskrats are called rats because somebody thought they looked like a rat, but they're actually more closely related to voles and lemmings. Now, also differing from our beaver, a beaver is strictly a vegetarian. A muskrat is not. Now, about 95% of its diet is plants, but they will also eat mussels, they'll eat frogs and fish and things like that if they can get a hold of them. Now, they play an important role in our wetlands because they are also prey for mink, foxes, coyotes, bobcats, raptors such like hawks and eagles, and then even the baby muskrats are food for hawks and owls, snapping turtles and otters, things like that. Now, if you do want to come hike in our wetlands, you can buy a day pass online or call the forest, or if you're a member, you can hike in our wetlands. But if you're going to do that, you should be aware that some of our trails are closed. So you can see down here on the left, this is where our wetlands are, where this circle is. This is Gifford Point. This is what it looked like in March of last year, 2019, when we had the flooding. That whole area was completely underwater. So, and that caused some damage to our trails. So here you can see, this is Camp Gifford Road. Here is this dotted line. Most of the trails north of Camp Gifford Road are open, except for Walking Club Trail here, S, is still closed. But most of the trails south of that road are still closed. The boardwalk was pretty much destroyed, and a lot of these trails were damaged. So they're working on getting those rehabbed, but it's not done yet. So please stay on only the trails that are open. If you'd like information on upcoming programs from Fontenelle Forest, or if you want to become a member, please visit our website. If you're interested in booking a program like this privately for your group, you can contact me. This is my phone number and my email address. We do want to thank some of our sponsors. With COVID-19 happening, we weren't able to do our normal big fundraising event, but these are companies that have generously given to the forest, and that allows us to keep bringing programs like this to you during this time. Thanks again for tuning in, and we will see you in a couple of weeks.